Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be talking about the staining process that I used on this project right here. So the staining process, you guys have been following along with the channel for the past few months here. It's something that I've been experimenting a lot with, trying to figure out how to take a piece of wood and change that color to something that is actually going to look good. And I've had some great success, I've had some pretty good failures too along the way, but I finally found a solution to staining wood that works out really well, and that's exactly what we're going to be covering in this video right here. So before we actually get on to the staining process, we need to start by talking about the wood, because what wood you choose is going to heavily affect the final look of the piece. For a little bit of context, this piece right here, the stained portions are made from hard maple. And what I find particularly interesting about the staining process I'm going to show you guys here is the fact that I was able to get this really deep, rich color on hard maple. That's something that I did not think was possible, which is the whole reason I'm making this video, because this was absolutely amazing to find out. So in this demonstration here, we're going to be using two very different woods. On this side, we've got white ash, and on this side, we've got hard maple. Now, I say that these are two very different woods because white ash is known for being very porous. It's got very large open pores, which means that it's going to take the stain very easily. Whereas on the other side, we've got hard maple, which has very tightly packed pores. It's a much denser wood, and it has a much harder time accepting most stains. So these two woods, again, are about as opposite as they can get, and they're going to give you two completely different looks in your final project. The hard maple is going to have a much cleaner overall look, whereas the white ash is going to have a little bit more of a grainier look to it. And so this one on this demonstration, I'm going to go through and show you guys what they're both going to look like, because I think it's important to understand that before you get into a project, just choosing the right wood to start with is going to have a massive effect on your final piece. Moving on to the surface prep, this is the most important part of staining wood. You want to make sure that you take the time to do a really good job on your surface prep. You want to get rid of any tear out, any streak marks, any possible knife marks in that you may have in your pieces. Because all of those little areas are what's going to pick up a much more coloring and staining compared to the rest of the piece of wood, and they're going to end up getting highlighted later on. So your surface prep needs to be top notch for any piece of wood that you're going to be putting stain on. Now, this is going to be a little bit on the controversial side, but what I've found is that what the manufacturer recommends is not always going to be the best practice. But what I've found across all the different products that I've tried is it's much more important to find a surface prep method that works for you as an individual woodworker rather than something that worked for some dude somewhere doing some test piece in a shop somewhere, right? That's kind of how the manufacturers, they just kind of find a method that worked for them and they're sharing that with you. It's very important for you as a woodworker to have a method of your own that might work better for you. Now for my method, I like to use a hand plane wherever possible and then sanding wherever I can't hand plane. So what I'll typically do for my surface prep process is I'll take my pieces just like this through the jointer, planer, table saw, just doing my rough milling and all that. On a lot of pieces, I will use my drum sander to get them up to 220 grit. The trick with the drum sander is it doesn't actually fully sand the piece to a finished sanded surface, so you're still gonna have to go back and do some surface prep, but it does do a decent job to get rid of a lot of that tear out. But in most cases, I've actually kind of gotten away from using my drum sander so much, and I'm actually trying to use my hand plane a little bit more often, just because this thing is way more fun to use and it looks better on the videos. We can all be honest, when you see somebody using a hand plane in a video, it just looks cooler. The problem with the hand plane though, that I've found with a lot of your different stains in that, is because the hand plane actually cuts the surface, it's slicing away that thin layer of material, it leaves all of your pores very open. So it doesn't really matter if you're talking about ash or maple, those pores are gonna be much more open. What ends up happening is all the color in that stain just shoots down those open pores. It doesn't disperse enough. So even if you are a hand tool master, all you use is hand planes and card scrapers, and that's how you do all of your surface prep. What you're gonna wanna add as a final step there is just doing a quick hand sanding with some 180 grit sandpaper. This is going to just kind of roughen up that surface and make it so that stain can disperse across. And so with our wood fully prepped now, we can move on to the actual staining process. Now, one thing I want to say quickly here about the staining process is that this is a multi-step process. The process that I used to get that really nice, rich, dark brown color on that project was not easy. And that's one of those things to understand here is that this is not just, a DIY job of staining. What you want to avoid doing when you're trying to stain wood is going to the big box store, picking up a can of Minwax wood finish, and just slapping that onto your pieces. The problem with this product, for one, super toxic. If you're going to use a product like this, you need to make sure that, a garage door is open, you've got good airflow flowing through, and even with all that airflow, I would still be wearing a full-on respirator because this stuff is very toxic. The other problem with this is you don't know what is in it. You have no way of knowing what are the ingredients in this mixture, and you have really no way of controlling it. So you might get a good result on one wood, but you're not going to get a good result on another wood, and it may not be compatible with different finishes and whatnot that you want to use later on. So overall, this is not the route that you want to go. what we're going to be using as our first step in this staining process is General Finishes water-based dye. Now we'll cover this really quickly because this is kind of a mind-numbing thing and I highly recommend you do your own research on it to help it make more sense. So in the world of stains, you can go basically two different routes. On one side you can go with a pigment-based stain, on the other side you can go with a dye-based stain. Now the primary difference between these two is that a pigment-based stain includes larger pigments. So these are usually natural earth pigments. They come from colors of the earth, from whatever items that have been crushed up and turned into a powder. And when you mix that powder with a carrying agent like an oil, whatever, those larger pigments are what are giving that color to the wood. It's a very similar idea to just painting the wood, but the idea with those pigments is that they're going to get trapped in the pores of the wood and they're going to fill in some of that color. Now obviously, as I say, larger pigments, you can probably start to think that, okay, that's going to run into a problem with a wood like maple. So then on the other side you have dyes, which is exactly where our first step is going to be here, using this dye stain. And a dye is very different from a pigment stain because the particles are so small they can very easily punch through the smallest of pores, even in woods like maple, which gives a much richer and deeper color. So that's why you always want to start your staining process with a dye. So before you get going with the staining process, you want to make sure you got everything ready to go. So when you're dealing with a dye, or really any stain in general, you want to make sure you're wearing gloves because you don't want to permanently change the color of your hand. Dyes especially are going to pretty much permanently change the color of your hands, which is not great. So just make sure you're wearing some gloves. You also want to have a microfiber cloth, or even paper towel works. You want to use like shop towel, not like Bounty or anything like that, because those are going to disintegrate. But I found that these big box store microfiber cloths that you can buy in like a big bundle work really, really well because they're very absorbent and you can reuse them multiple times before they wear out. You're also going to want to use a brush here because the idea with this dye stain is that you want to put it on thick. You want to get a whole bunch of that dye on there so that it can soak into the wood, and you're just really trying at this point soak the wood with that color. So using a brush, you can use a natural bristle brush. This is just a cheap one from Canadian Tire. You don't need to be fancy with it. Another thing with these dye stains, every time you open it, just give it a quick stir. Make sure that that dye is fully mixed into that water. I haven't really noticed an issue of it separating out, but it just seems like a good habit to get into with pretty much any finish you use. You just always want to give it a quick stir. Then it's really, again, just a matter of absolutely soaking the wood. So you can see there, I'm just getting it on nice and as thick as I possibly can, and we're trying to cover the surface in as little time as possible. So one of the things you want to avoid doing when dealing with a dye, whether it's alcohol-based or water-based, is trying to do large sections. So when I did that project that you guys can see behind me there, I made sure to do it in all small pieces. And the reason for that is just because it's very easy to get a good, accurate coloring across a small piece, whereas if you try to do it across a large piece, you're going to get some areas where the dye is going to build up a little bit too much, or you're not going to get enough dye, stuff like that. So you just want to make sure that you're getting that dye on as nice and evenly as absolutely possible. And especially this first coat, the wood is going to be very, very thirsty, so you just want to get on as much as you possibly can. And you'll know you're done when the stain is basically sitting on top of the wood. So you can see on the ash here, we're actually doing pretty good. We've got it sitting mostly on top of the wood here. Same thing on the maple, we're still soaking in a few places. And you just want to keep moving that dye stain around until it kind of sits on the surface. If you're doing multiple pieces at a time, you really can just kind of do a couple pieces, then you're going to wipe the stain off, do a couple more pieces, wipe the stain. But now that we've let these pieces sit for 10-20 seconds, where you can now go through and just wipe off the excess stain. Now, I know exactly what you're thinking at this moment. That looks like absolute crap. And the most important thing to remember about the staining process is that it is a process. So stage one here, this looks absolutely horrible. We've got all this like blotchy color going on. Even the piece of ash, which is supposed to be a wood that stains really nicely, does not look good. Neither of these pieces look good at the moment, and if this was on an actual project, you'd probably be panicking just a little bit. So it's important to remind yourself through the whole process of staining is that this is a long, drawn-out process. We've got multiple steps until these pieces are gonna look like that. So after a few hours, both of our pieces are now fully dried up and we're ready to move on to the next step, which is more sanding. So now what we're gonna go through and do is hand sand both of these pieces with 180 grit sandpaper, and just to remove the fuzziness. We're not trying to get rid of this whole first coat of color, we're just trying to get rid of that fuzziness that's left behind by that water-based stain. So you might be wondering, why not just raise the grain before you apply the stain, and that'll save you that whole extra sanding step. And I found that if you use the stain to raise the grain of the wood and you do that first sanding coat, that really does help get a better color. I can't really explain explain why. It doesn't really make sense to me, but I think it has something to do with, you know, getting the color deeper into the wood on that first pass through, and then, you know, something after that. But through the testing that I've done, I have found that there is a difference between when you use water to raise the grain initially, and then you just go through and do your staining process, versus when you just use that first coat of stain to raise the grain. So we're just gonna go through, sand both of these down, and then we'll be on to our next 2 coats of the dye stain. So now we're gonna do 2 more coats of the General Finishes dye stain. We're just gonna put them on, wipe them off the exact same way we did the first one, and then we're gonna let those fully cure up. The nice thing is that because this is a water-based dye stain, it does dry pretty quickly. So you can actually do all 3 of these coats within basically a full work day's time. Now, one thing that's important to mention really quickly here is the reason I'm recommending the General Finishes dye stain is because it includes resins in the mixture of the liquids there. So if you ever worked with other water-based or even some oil-based stains, when you go to do a second coat, what you'll notice sometimes is that as you're applying that second coat, you'll be picking up the color and all that from the first coat. And that can cause a lot of problems because you can end up getting weird color combinations in some areas where you've got heavy amounts of color, some areas where you don't have enough color, and that can be a serious problem. So that's one of the reasons why I highly recommend this General Finishes dye stain, is because every coat that you do is going to get locked in place because of those included resins in the dye stain. It also helps seal up the pores of the wood. It's still a porous finish, so you can still use like a natural oil finish over it, but it does work really well to make sure that each consecutive layer of dye stain that you're going to do isn't picking up the color from the first. This is not a sponsored bit. This is just the best stuff that I've been able to find for using dye on wood. So now with 3 coats of dye stain on both of our pieces, we're ready to move on to the next stage, which is using a pigment-based stain as a top coat. Because as you can see from these sample clips here, both of these pieces have some key issues. On our piece of ash, interestingly enough, the very open pores of that wood don't actually pick up any of that dye stain. So we end up with this overall very dark color, but all the pores still have that really light natural color of the wood from its original state. Now, I really wish I knew how to explain why that was happening, because we are quite literally flooding the entire surface of the thing with that dye stain. You would think that some of it would get into those pores, and I'm guessing that it does, but for some reason it doesn't want to stick in there. On the maple, we end up with a very high contrast between our different grains. So our softer grains pick up a ton of that dye stain and hold on to a lot of that color, whereas those harder grains don't pick up as much color and they end up with an overall lighter appearance. So what we want to do on both of these pieces is help kind of even out that overall color. Now, if you like that high contrast look that both of these woods currently have, you could top coat these with whatever your preferred finish is and call it a day. But for me, I want something that has a little bit more of an even color, again, much like I did on that project. So what we want to go through and do now is coat these with a pigment heavy stain. Because if you remember before when I talked about the differences between stains, dye stains have very, very small particles that shoot deep into the wood and give you a much richer, deeper color. Whereas pigment stains use those larger particles that tend to sit more on the surface of the wood and help give a more consistent color throughout. So this stage of the process is where you can get a little bit creative with it. So the stain that I use to get that really deep, rich, dark brown color is the Minwax Coffee Stain. Now this is a dark brown that matches the dark brown dye stain. So by combining those 2 stains, you get that really dark brown color. But what we can also do is use a walnut gel stain. So all this is about a medium brown kind of color. And so by using a different colored gel stain compared to whatever the dye stain it is you use, you'll end up with those a little bit of different colors. So you can actually start to mimic natural wood by having those different tones and colors in there. Adding on to that creativity, you can actually make your own stains, which is something that I'm experimenting with at the moment. And you can make these in whatever color you want. Now I know you can't tell it on camera, but this is actually a dark green stain. And I'm gonna be using on these test pieces because this is something that I'm trying to figure out at the moment to see if it's actually going to work, and this is a perfect opportunity. I've got these 2 perfectly prepared test pieces, so I'm going to see what this stain does compared to these other 2. So again, if you want that really rich dark brown color that I got on that actual project, then you're going to want to match the gel stain basically to the dye stain that you're using. If you want to bring in a little bit more visual interest, maybe some more colors and whatnot, go with a complementary color, you know, go with like a lighter brown. If you're using like a black dye stain, you could actually go over with some white to really pump up that contrast, make it kind of intense. But this is where you really have that creative freedom, or you can also take this opportunity to add in a little bit of color and just kind of see how that goes. So now in order to get a good sample, I'm just gonna go through on each of these boards, divvy them up into 3 sections, and then we'll apply our 3 different stains on top of the dye stain that we've already got here. We'll let them dry, and then we'll see what the colors look like in the final product. So when applying your gel stain, do not apply it the way that the manufacturer recommends. I believe Minwax on their can, they say either to use a paintbrush or a foam brush and apply a heavy coat going in the direction of the wood. What you're gonna wanna do instead is get yourself some of these non-abrasive pads, or you can use like shop towel. You're gonna wanna get some good amount of stain on there, and what you're gonna do is go in circular patterns on the wood. This is not as important for woods like maple, but especially on ash, it is extremely important, because what this is gonna do is it's gonna pack those pigments into those open pores. Because when you do those circular patterns, there's times you're gonna be going across the grain. So those pigments are gonna get pushed up against the sidewalls of those pores and get packed down into those pores. We want as dense of a color as we can possibly get. So it's really important to take your time and really massage that gel stain into there. And just keep your pad loaded up, and this will give you the best color possible. Then once you've gone through and you've done that circular pattern, this is where you're gonna wanna go back through and put on a nice heavy coat of that gel stain so it has an opportunity to soak in. Because the gel stain is literally just pigments and some carrying oil. But it's mainly pigments, so you really want a lot of it on there. You want it built up on the surface, and then you wanna let it soak in, I believe, for about 5 minutes with these Minwax ones. For your natural ones, if you're using like a natural oil like tung oil or linseed oil, you're gonna wanna leave that probably for 20 minutes to an hour, if that. And again, when you're wiping off that gel stain, just go in that circular pattern until you've got off as much as you possibly can. You want to make sure there's not globs of that stuff on the surface, because it will eventually harden up. That's the downside to using those kind of more modern finishes, is they will dry up and harden in a hard substance. So you want to get them off as much as you possibly can. And again, that circular pattern, just make sure that you're grinding that pigment pretty deep into the wood, or as deep as it'll go. With those gel stains all cured up now, we've got some pretty interesting results, but the only way we can really get a good idea of what's going on here is by doing one final top coat. So I'm going to be using tried and true original oil to top coat both of these pieces, just because it gives a nice overall color to the wood, plus it brings in some nice surface feel with some light duty protection. Because of that, include beeswax. Now obviously, if you're building a piece of furniture that's going to see a lot of heavy use, you're going to want to use a little bit more of a protective finish, because the problem when you're dealing with stain is that if it ever gets damaged pretty deeply, you are going to get some of that natural wood showing through. And in this case with the maple, that's going to be a pretty stark contrast. So that's where on like a tabletop or something, you might want to use like Armor Seal, Osmo, Rubio, one of those more heavier duty finishes that's going to offer a little more protection. So the tried and true oil will work really good to kind of bring in that final top coat and add in some of that final color. But it is really important to consider how your piece is going to be used in order to best protect it in the long run. Alright, so with that top coat on there, it's not fully cured up yet because the tried and true oils take about 24 to 48 hours to fully cure up, and we don't want to wait that long. But this actually gives us a pretty good idea of what all of our different stains are going to look like. So on this side here, we have that coffee gel stain. In the middle here, we have the walnut gel stain, and then on the end here, I have that natural green stain that I made up here. Then we have those 2 stripes in the middle here that are just the dye stain, nothing else on top. And so you can actually see there is a pretty significant difference between all 3 of these. Now with that coffee gel stain, what we end up getting is a very rich dark brown color. That's exactly what we expected. With the walnut, we end up with a little bit of a lighter dark brown color, but we do have that kind of medium brown evening everything out. With that homemade dark green gel stain, we end up with a very similar color to the coffee, but within the pores of the ash here, we do actually have some of those green undertones, which is kind of interesting. And really the only difference between those stripes in the middle here and the outer portions where we have that second layer of stain is that the areas where we use that second level of stain have a little bit more consistent color to them, whereas those strips are have a little bit higher contrast and whatnot. That's really the only difference there. Now the only problem here is that on camera, it's probably pretty challenging for you guys to tell the difference of like what is going on between these different levels of stains, because it's a very, very subtle difference. But I do actually have a perfect demonstration of that, and that is this piece right here. So this is a piece of ash where I used a black dye stain and then I coated that with a white gel stain. So you can see exactly what happens with the results here is we end up with basically a 50% gray coloring. So you're basically taking half black and half white, and that gives you a 50% gray. Then in the pores of the wood, we end up with that really white coloring. So the pores are where you're really gonna pick up a lot of that stark coloring with those white pigments. And that's exactly what's happening on all of these pieces right here. So it's just a matter of basically color math. If you take one color plus another color and combine them together, most of your piece is going to end up being a mixture of about 50-50 of those two colors. But the pores of your wood, especially in a wood like ash, which has really large open pores, is going to end up picking up more of that heavier pigment and going to be more the color of whatever that gel stain you use. So again, this is a process that takes a lot of testing in order to create a bunch of different results, but you do have a ton of freedom to create some really interesting looking pieces. So the final and probably most important thing to mention here is that this is all about the process, not the specific products. If you don't have access to General Finishes dye stain because no one around you sells it, you can't get it shipped in, anything like that, you can use literally any other type of dye that's on the market. Even something as simple as going over to Michael's or whatever crafting stores around you and getting some of this right dye. And you can get this stuff in really any color you want, mix them to get your own specific colors, all that kind of stuff. And that's actually a super cheap way to do it and does the exact same thing as this General Finishes dye stain. For your second level of staining, all you need to find is a pigment heavy stain. So gel stains are ideal, but there's also other options for pigment heavy stains that are on the market. But there are a ton of brands out there that actually make gel stains, so it shouldn't be hard to find one that's gonna work for you. Then finally, for your top coat, you can really go with whatever is gonna suit your needs. If you need a lot of heavy duty protection, you can go with a specific finish. If you want a nice surface feel, you can go with like tried and true like I use here. It really doesn't matter what you use as long as you follow those 3 steps. So you always want to start with a dye stain to establish that really deep color. You then want to use a pigment heavy stain like a gel stain to create a much more consistent color throughout. Then you want to top coat that to add that final level of protection to help keep your stain sealed in so that it's not going to wear off. So if you guys have any questions about this process, or there's anything you think I missed out on, just let me know in the comments down below. But as always guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one.